Reason number 6, personal energy independence. This one I think has become more and more and more important in the eyes of the people that I talk to when they're buying solar over the last decade that I've been doing this. It was important to me from the beginning because I used to be a systems officer, telecommunications systems officer for the Marine Corps, and I was always concerned about our electrical grid. But personal energy independence has become more and more a thing. In 2015, Ted Koppel wrote a book called Lights Out, and my daughter, knowing my past in the Marine Corps as a systems officer and my concern about the electrical grid, sent me or bought me this book for my birthday. The premise of the book, and it states it right at the front, it says, the notion that America's power grid system is vulnerable to cyber attack or an electromagnetic pulse device launched by terrorists or a foreign nation is a frightening premise. And Ted Koppel's not, Alex Jones or something like that, right? This is Ted Koppel, not Alex Jones talking. So, you take it serious. Now, he wrote that book in 2015. That's 7 years ago. And as I've been thinking about it, this is what we've been hearing in the news just the last couple of days. In March 2nd of 2022, so just 3 weeks ago from when I was writing it, or when I'm videoing this, Time Magazine had an article, and it said, and right now, so for those that are watching this in the distant future, right now we're in that, Russia has attacked the Ukraine. And they said, in the recently short and rapidly evolving history of cyber conflict, perhaps nothing has been established with greater certainty and more widely accepted than the idea that Russia has significant cyber capability and isn't afraid to use them. The next paragraph goes on to explain. In 2015, the Russian government hackers breached the Ukrainian power grid, leading to widespread outages. In 2017, Russia deployed the notorious NotPetya malware via Ukrainian accounting software, and the virus quickly spread across the globe, costing businesses billions of dollars in damage and disruption. Then, literally 2 days ago, President Biden stood up and warned U.S. companies of a potential Russian cyber attack. This is in AP. Richmond, Virginia. President Joe Biden on Monday urged U.S. companies to make sure their digital doors are locked tight because of evolving intelligence that Russia is considering launching cyber attacks against critical infrastructure targets as the war in Ukraine continues. As I stated, I was a systems officer for the Marine Corps, and I studied critical infrastructure protection. So why is our grid, the power grid, or critical infrastructure protection, why is it vulnerable? Why is our grid so vulnerable? And by the way, I looked into this back in the early 1990s as a young lieutenant. I looked into this, and because I was in charge of it. I had to write the security manual for the 1st Marine Division. Here's the history of it. 1920, utility companies formed what they called joint operations, or sharing peak load and coverage backup. Now, back in the day, 1920s, electrical companies were just in the major cities. But in 1934, during the Great Depression, as part of the deal to get more electricity out there and to create jobs, the Public Utility Holding Act was passed, and they said that the utility grid is a public good. And therefore, they forced all of these local city monopolies to service both cities and rural communities. I mean, think about it. Where are you going to make more money for your buck? By putting electricity inside of a city where you got houses close to each other, or running lines out to Timbuktu in the middle of no place where the farmers live, right? So that was what had happened. One of the things that helped create jobs was taking the centralized model of telephone, AT&T at the time, and moving it out into the rural areas, calling it a public good, as well as electricity. So many of the power plants that we have are part of this that was created back in the 1930s. That's how old some of these things are, okay? Then, 1992, the Energy Policy Act of 1992 required owners of transmission lines to allow people that generated electricity, electrical generation companies. Now, those used to all be the same, but now they were saying, hey, you can generate electricity here and not actually own the lines, and that they had to allow them to access their transmission lines, thus splitting apart the generation of electricity from the transportation of electricity from that centralized location, transmitting it over those huge power lines that we see along the freeways when we're driving on the freeway, and then the distribution inside of the cities, or distribution inside of small cities, whatever. So they broke those three up in 1992. Then in 2005, George Bush Jr. signed the Energy Policy Act of 2005, providing incentives and loan guarantees for alternative energy. Again, we've talked about this. It's net metering, or what they call buyback, right? And it also gave us the ITC, or the incentive tax credits, right? So those things have kind of broken up the grid. Why is it so vulnerable? Well, it looks like this. The Western United States is part of what's called the Western Interconnection. That's the one I'm most familiar with. Like I said, I was born and raised in Arizona. As a Marine, I was at Camp Pendleton and Oregon. My daughter, as I said, lives in Utah. So I've lived in many of the Western states, although I currently live in Texas. So I was a young Marine lieutenant in July of 1996. The thing was, we were in Minnesota when this happened, and I didn't experience this. I was at Camp Pendleton, but we were on vacation in Minnesota on July 2nd, so I didn't see it. But Saturday, August 10th, burned itself into my head. Here's why. It was a Saturday, got up in the morning, and I told my boys, I said, look, you guys want to go to the motocross, the bicycle motocross races this afternoon in Temecula? I'll take you if you help me work in the yard. Okay, so we're all out in the yard working, boom, 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 boom. Didn't need any electricity to be out in the yard. Go jump in the car, fire up the car, and we drive down, and I look at the gas meter, and I see that we need gas. And so we drive down to the gas station. There was a gas station right at the bottom of the hill where we lived, and I pulled in. And I went to the pump, and there was no electricity on the pump. I was like, well, that's weird. So I walked over to the attendant, who's still sitting inside the booth, and I said, hey, what's up? He goes, no electricity. I was like, oh, all right. So I get back in my car and I fire it up and I look at the gas gauge again. I thought, I can probably make it to Temecula. So I got the truck. I got 5 bicycles, 4 kids, and we're driving to Temecula, which, if you are familiar with Vista, California, where we lived, which is near Camp Pendleton, to get out to Temecula is about 30 miles. It's over the I-15 and it's very steep mountains. So we're coming down the mountain into Temecula. Luckily, the bicycle motocross place was off the first exit, and I'm thinking, man, we're on fumes. I have no more gas. And I had been listening to CDs because we had a CD player in my truck, and I was just like, yeah, this is cool. So I didn't listen to the radio. We get off the exit. We pull over to the gas station. I pull in, and I walk over to the pump, and there's no electricity. I was like, wait a minute here. So I go over, and I talk to that attendant. I said, hey, what's up? No electricity? He goes, no, there's no electricity in the entire Western United States, from Canada down to Mexico. I'm like, what? Yeah, there's no electricity from Canada all the way to Mexico right now. I did not have cash in my pocket. I had my ATM card, right? Now, I promised the boys that they could go racing at the bicycle motocross thing, but I didn't have any cash with me. So we drove, it was really only about a half a mile from the gas station, over to where the bike races were at, and they had they didn't need the electricity during the day to run the races, so we watched the races. I couldn't pay to get them in because I didn't have my ATM card, but they at least got to watch, and the whole time I'm just sitting there thinking, what on earth am I going to do tonight if there's still no electricity? I got no gas in the car, I've got no electricity, I got 4 kids, 2 of them teenagers and 2 of them little children, and 5 bicycles. What are we going to do? Ride back in the dark up those mountains to get from Temecula back to Vista, California? It was like, this is crazy. What are we going to do? The other thought that was going through my head, again, as a Marine, I had been stationed in Okinawa before I got to Camp Pendleton. And I had flown back from Okinawa 2 days after the Rodney King incident. And I'm not trying to turn this into a political issue, who's right, who's wrong. It's just that incident had happened. My best friend picked me up at LAX, and he drove me through some of the areas in Los Angeles that had been affected the most. And it was only like 2 days after that. So that was still seared in my head back then as to what had happened in these neighborhoods where there had been this rioting. And I'm just thinking, dang, what's going to happen if there's no electricity tonight? In the entire, from Canada down to Mexico. Luckily, it came on. It was just a 6-hour thing. I was able to go to an ATM, get cash. I was able to go pay for gas, and the kids were able to watch the races, and we were able to drive home. But as a young systems officer, that scared the crap out of me, to be honest with you. It really did. What would happen? I mean, if you take that 6 hours and you multiply it by 6 and you go, what happens after a day with no electricity? What happens after 2 days? What happens after a week? What happens after 2 weeks without electricity? You can imagine what's going to happen in places like Los Angeles, and it's not going to be pretty. So that's what got me thinking. And again, a year after that, President Clinton, because of what happened that day, President Clinton commissioned what was called the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection. As I said, I was a systems officer for the Marine Corps at Camp Pendleton. My job was to keep the systems running during war. So I had to think about electricity. I had to think about telecommunications. I had to think about uplinks to satellites and connections to utility companies. That's what like the telephone companies. That's what I got paid to do. And so I read this thing. They published it at www.pccip.gov. And they literally published this entire report. And I kept reading it going, why on earth is this in the public domain? Right? But it was. I looked for it the day of 9/11. So this happened, again, it was put out in 2017. I looked for it on the day of 9/11. It was off the web. But I know it was there still in 2020 because I was teaching Marines at Oregon State University. I was the Marine officer instructor, and the last class that we taught in the history of warfare was the future of warfare. And I made my Marines go read this, certain parts of it, to understand the future of warfare is to wipe out people's critical infrastructures. Right? So that's what I've been teaching. Again, that came out in July of 1997, and it was still online sometime in 2020. I got out in 2021, and 9/11 happened in 21. So sometime between 2020 and 2021, that was taken down. It's now housed someplace on the Homeland Security area. But what they're talking about, if you've never thought about critical infrastructure, it is our power grid, it is telecommunications grid, it's the gas, oil, storage, and transportation. Right? Banking and finance infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, the water supply, our emergency services, government services like police and ambulances and things of that nature, fire trucks. All of those things make up our critical infrastructure. But if you look at that list closely, none of them can work without electricity. And that, to me, is the Achilles heel. In fact, Diane and I were watching General Clark, Wesley Clark, during the war in Kosovo, and he was an Army dog, and he was being asked by a reporter, because there's been an argument between the Air Force and the Army since the days of General LeMay after World War II. General LeMay was an Air Force guy who kept saying we don't need an army anymore, we can just blow people's critical infrastructure to bits. And that's what had happened in Kosovo, is we had blown up their critical infrastructure, and this reporter understood that, and so he got right in General Wesley Clark's face, and he said, so has the Air Force finally proven that there's no need for an army? All we have to do is just, from the safety of our airplanes, blow up their critical infrastructures and they're gone? And General Clark gets upset, because again, he's an Army dog, and he says, no, the only time here in Kosovo, it doesn't matter. Their critical infrastructures barely work anyhow. You want to mess up a society by blowing up their critical infrastructures? You have to blow up the critical infrastructure of a nation like... And he stops. And I looked at my wife, and she looked at me. We were both Marine officers. And we finished the sentence. Ours? He stopped. He didn't say it. But it was like, yeah, no kidding. We are completely dependent on our critical infrastructures. Whereas third world countries, they ain't got water. They know where to go to get it out of a well, right? If they don't have electricity, they've all got little candles in their houses. They're used to not having robust critical infrastructures. Our problem is we are completely dependent on those critical infrastructures, and we have no crankback. We have no way to go back one generation because we don't have it. Anyhow, that's what scared me as a Marine. It's what scares me today. A couple weeks ago, a friend of mine called and said, hey, Eric, in fact, he was a Marine, a guy I used to share a room with in Okinawa. He called me and he said, hey, Eric, I've been listening to this book by Glenn Beck called The Great Reset. I think you'd enjoy it. I don't want to get into that. I definitely don't want this to become a political thing, but I have Audible and I'm always listening to books, so I had no problem listening to a book by Glenn Beck. So I put it in and I listened to it, and Glenn Beck argues for nuclear power in there. And he poo-poos solar power, right? My problem is that Glenn Beck is still thinking that solar is a centralized, not a decentralized solution. So my question to you, Mr. Beck, would be, okay, where's the generation? He says it should be nuclear power. That's fine. I think it is clean, and I think we could get away with it. So we can take away some of these old coal-burning plants and put in nuclear plants. But that's just the generation piece of it. You still have to have the transport piece of it. And that part of our infrastructure is also falling apart, as is much of the distribution. It was made on old copper wires. I saw this out there. That's the skyline of Los Angeles. And NERC, which is in charge of keeping our infrastructure alive, said to routers, the U.S. to face increased power reliability issues over the next 10 years. Right? Now, let me read this to you. It says, the organization responsible for the North American electric reliability said on Friday that several parts of the United States could face energy shortfalls during the next decade due to insufficient power generation resources. That, again, was been pointed out by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We have a lot of old, antiquated buildings that were built during the 1934 to 50 era, and these old things are falling apart, and they cannot pass inspections. And so I read this in the Wall Street Journal, again, just a couple weeks ago, February 18th, 2022. America's power grid is increasingly unreliable. Behind a rising number of outages are new stresses on the system caused by and aging power lines. That's the transmission portion of it. And changing climate and power plant fleet rapidly going green. That's a euphemism, rapidly going green. That's a euphemism for we have to get rid of all these old buildings that were built in the 30s and 40s and 50s because they're putting out so much smoke. We've got to get rid of these old buildings. And so they're upgrading them. So even if Glenn Beck is right that nuclear is much better than solar, and I agree with him, if we keep a central model. But that's the thing we don't need in our homes these days. So another thing I often hear from people is that, you know, that are against the solar thing is that tax credit is helping us buy solar. I was listening to something by Elon Musk once, and he said, well, we know the coal industry is subsidized, and he threw out some number, 20x or whatever it was, I don't remember, more than the solar industry. And I thought, I've never heard that. And so again, I went to my dad, who was the IRS auditor, and I said, hey, Dad, how is it that the coal industry is subsidized more than the solar industry? I know what the solar thing. He said, it's because of the depletion deduction. I said, what's that? He said, every time they scrape away coal, right? Every time they take away that coal, they get to say that their asset has been depleted. It's kind of like the deduction you get to take on a building, you know, over 30 years. And so that's how they get away with it. And so the coal industry is much more, I mean, magnitudes more subsidized than the solar industry. The difference? Who gets the benefit of the coal industry being subsidized? The owners of the coal mines and the electrical industry. Not you and I, the shareholders of those, unless you own stocks, right? But who gets the benefit of the ITC, the tax credit for solar? You and I get that. We make up that decision, and we get that money right back in our pockets, which is not where it's happening with the coal. So coal energy is a limited resource. It's not free, and it's expensive to extract and to burn. Coal is owned by an elite. Again, I'm not against elites. I'm not saying that, but just understand. The Queen of England owns Rio Tinto. She's a majority shareholder, and they own Cloud Peak Energy, which is one of the mines that gets all that coal. And then it's also a regulated monopoly, and that's why people like Warren Buffett invest in it. Again, I got nothing against Warren Buffett. I'm just pointing out, as I said in another video, whose asset are you paying for? Yours or theirs, right? So it's a regulated monopoly. Berkshire Hathaway owns Pacific Corp, and Pacific Corp owns a number of electric companies. Why? Because it's a regulated monopoly, and they get a certain fixed amount of, well, it's not fixed, but they ask for it every year, and they get it increased in the cost of our electricity. And then here's the real problem with the centralized model, is that, as we've just seen, both the power generation plants and the transport is antiquated, which is creating single points of failure, as we saw here in Texas last year, right? When that storm hit Texas, all those red areas were affected. 4.5 million customers here in Texas didn't have power, and that's because the infrastructure, the generation plants, and the transport infrastructure fell apart. It could not handle what was going on. So those are single points of failure. My first week when I went to go visit my daughter, who was living in Salt Lake at the time, I was driving down a road, heading into an area, when all of a sudden a tornado touched down in front of me. I had never seen a tornado. Again, I'm from Arizona. I've lived most of my life in Arizona and California with the Marine Corps. And I had never seen a tornado, and it popped down literally right in front of me, about a mile away. I was like, oh my gosh. So I turned around, I went zipping back to my daughter's house. The next day, I drove to the neighborhood where that tornado had hit, and that's one of the houses. It was just, torn apart. And then this was another house on the street. And then I saw the house was solar, and nothing had happened there. Let me put on a little video for you, and you can see that. Here in Washington Terrace, you can see how just after the tornado, that house lost most of its roof. That one lost a lot of shingles. This one lost the entire roof. Can't see it behind the trees, but that blue is a tarp, obviously. And then the one next door had solar panels, and it's still doing fine. Now, let's compare that to solar, right? Solar energy, in my opinion, is the third industrial revolution. Every hour the sun radiates more energy on this earth than the entire human population uses in 1 year. Solar energy is free, it's clean, it's inexhaustible. Okay, billions of years into the future, the sun will be gone, all right. Sun's energy is decentralized, and the sun's energy shines on everybody, both rich and poor. There's no way, at least that I can come up with right now, to monopolize the sun coming down on our homes. And it isn't, by the way, I hope you don't think I'm saying just get off the grid, because I'm not. The grid is there, but you can diminish your grid dependence today to almost nothing, right? So here's my question again for Mr. Beck. When I have solar power on my house and I am my own grid, right? Where is the generation of that electricity? Right on top of my roof, right? In my solar panels. And where's the transportation? Well, it goes down those electrical wires to the inverter and down to a battery if you've got a battery. And where is the distribution network? It's the copper wiring that came inside my home anyhow, right? The point is, you can still be tied to the grid without being dependent upon it. If you've got batteries, you can cost effectively put in place today what you need to be grid independent. And that's what this is about in my mind. It's not that you have to be off grid, out living in the sticks, right? Like the preppers. You can live in the middle of a big city, doesn't matter. You can still be grid independent. So when that cyber attack comes or whatever happens or that storm happens, you can have electricity. Once again, you can't do that without a storage device. And if you're using the grid as your storage device, you're just as vulnerable as anybody else. You must have battery backup. We specialize in that. Talk to me and I can get you some very inexpensive solutions on how you can be nearly off-grid. Not being off-grid, but be off-grid independent. So you'd be energy independent. And that was what I wanted to talk about. Personal energy independence.